Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 11th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Colorado and the Republican Party and a primary that occurred about 2 weeks ago in the state, nearly 2 weeks ago. Tomorrow will officially mark 2 weeks ago. It was June 29th, I believe, from the day that this article was written. Maybe it was the 28th. Regardless, it was primary day in the state of Colorado. Now, the reason why I didn't cover this way back then was because I believed at the time there were some more pressing things going on. That was immediately following the Dobbs decision, and there was a lot going on. But what had happened in Colorado was something that I thought was interesting, never got around to actually making the video. So here I am going ahead and doing it. And as the title suggests, from the Associated Press, Colorado GOP rejects candidates who back Trump election lie. And that's exactly what happened in the Republican primary. Now, I will say, if you remember, Lauren Boebert, the Republican representative from Colorado, I believe their 3rd congressional district, she is a Republican. She is one of the biggest proponents of President Trump and is one of the most outspoken members of Congress on the GOP side. She did, in fact, win her primary, but for many of these important races across the state, most of these election backers or election lie backers for President Trump have lost their primaries. And some of the Republicans that did end up winning are surprisingly more moderate than you might think, especially to our surprise in a day and time where the conservative Republican Party has becoming even more conservative of a Republican Party. Just something to think about, and which is really attributing to our surprise within this entire primary. So I've highlighted a few things that might capture our interest just for the sake of looking at some of these primary election results. We are going to run through them really briefly and then talk about the individual candidates that these people ran against, why it was so important, and what had actually happened within the race. So on the governor's side, we have Jared Polis, a Democrat, ran unopposed, a very popular governor. He's probably going to win re-election. Realistically, it isn't going to be that competitive, but it could end up being competitive if there is some type of last-minute shift in favor of the GOP. Honestly, I'm not expecting it. I don't think you should, but surprising things have happened. More surprising things have happened in American politics, so never say never. But for right now, Democrats are definitely the favorites. On the GOP side, I believe this is pronounced Heidi Ganahl. They ended up winning this primary here, and it wasn't exactly a landslide victory, but this race definitely deserves some level of recognition, and we'll talk about why that might be. Because this candidate ran against another candidate who was an election denier for the 2020 election results. The U.S. Senate elections, Michael Bennet ran unopposed as a Democrat, not surprising. Also an incumbent, first elected in 2010, re-elected in 2016, on track to be re-elected in 2022, but definitely closer than the governor election and could be competitive by November, depending on the national environment. On the Republican side, another close race. The interesting thing, though, that Joe O'Dea is actually a pro-choice Republican. He is someone that really does well amongst, I would say, voters of that type of caliber, moderate, more traditional conservative voters. And obviously, being pro-choice as a Republican is never something that you would say is popular amongst the GOP, but I can say that in the general election, it would make him more electable. Ron Hanks, like the governor candidate that lost as well, is also an election denier. And these margins weren't super substantial. You're talking 10 points and 6 points across the state, 8 points. Nothing super substantial, but definitely a showing in a race and a state of the Republican Party where otherwise a candidate that takes these positions, that says the election was rigged, that says we need to go back to 2020 and overturn it, those types of candidates typically perform at the highest level possible. And the fact that they were defeated in Colorado is quite important. Now, they have state attorney general races in which both Republican and Democrat ran unopposed. Secretary of State, though, is where it really matters. And the reason why Secretary of State matters is because the Secretary of State has become elevated to one of the most important positions in United States politics. Because following President Trump's call on the 2020 election to be overturned, it has now turned, instead of the governor, lieutenant governor, or even incumbent president at the time, but to the Secretary of State to verify and, solidify election results to head to the Electoral College. Now, the governor does have to send over the electors. They do have to sign on and certify the results, but the Secretary of State has a lot of power. And depending on the state, they can impose new election laws, they can enforce different election laws, they can turn to the state legislature and push for different things to pass, they can choose what can and cannot be counted in some circumstances. It obviously isn't unilateral control over the election results, but there is a significant role that it does play as its sole purpose, not necessarily sole purpose, but one of its main purposes is to count elections and count the votes in many, many states. So on the Democratic side, that Democrat, Jenna Griswold, ran unopposed. There actually is a movement in Colorado. If you're from the state, you might know it. It's called #JailJenna, or Jenna. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. But it essentially says that they should put the Democrat Secretary of State in jail for rigging the 2020 election results. Now, Colorado isn't a state that was close. But yes, there are Republicans in Colorado that believe Colorado was stolen from President Trump. Despite President Biden winning the state by 14 percentage points, Republicans still believe that something was taken from them in this race. It's quite frankly, and I say this in all honesty, delusional. It's not something that we can entertain. It's not something that's even within the realm of possibility. If Colorado was rigged, what's to say Democrats didn't get Florida taken from them because of the Republican Secretary of State, or North Carolina, or Iowa, or Ohio? I mean, the argument can go both ways. I'd rather it not go both ways. I'd like to trust our election process. But to say a state that went to Biden by 14 points is just lunacy at this point, that it was rigged, that it was stolen, and that's not partisan to say. As much as some people would like to make it, it's not partisan to say, and I won't accept any criticism for saying the election was fair. Regardless, though, the Secretary of State election on the Republican side came down to the issue of election rigging. If you recognize the second-place candidate, Tina Peters, you might know her name because she grew to national recognition due to her inability to do things correctly as someone across her county level. We'll read a little bit more about her, and we'll talk about all these candidates more in depth, but I've covered all of the races that showed some pretty significant, I would say, losses in terms of just the fact that the positions that these Republicans typically take are the popular ones, the ones that elevate them to winning a primary. That no longer is the case, especially in the state of Colorado. So let's go ahead and begin. They start off by talking about the Secretary of State race. 4 years ago, we would have never talked about the Secretary of State race. It was one of the least followed races. If you don't know, you know Brad Raffensperger in the state of Georgia. He actually won in a runoff election in 2018. Nobody talked about it. There was no organizing behind it to the extent that there was in the Senate elections in 2021 or any other type of significant runoff election in other states. I mean, it is entirely, at least previously, an inconsequential election position. It rose to relevancy, maybe more specifically in Georgia when Brian Kemp was Secretary of State, but then when Brad Raffensperger was elected, nobody was really super alarmed. But then when President Trump took the nation by storm and then ultimately ended up asking these Republican Secretary of States, Republican governors, Republican state legislatures to overturn free and fair election results, that's when this became mainstream. That's when this became one of the most important positions in any state when it comes down to electoral politics, which is why we immediately start talking about Tina Peters. So she is the Mesa County clerk who became nationally known after being indicted for her role in a break-in of her own county election system. She was someone that people saw as a criminal. She was someone that people on the Republican side, though, at least some of them, might have seen as these candidates that did no wrong. There's actually a Republican who ran for the governor position or the Senate position who said that she did no wrong and that was criticized for it and ultimately ended up losing the primary. I'm talking about Ron Hanks here, but very, very interesting to say the least. But Tina Peters lost to Pam Anderson. Republicans made the right choice. They chose the candidate that did not endorse, did not take in these election lies and push the rhetoric. In fact, Pam Anderson is a critic of President Trump's election lies and a former clerk in suburban Denver who was well regarded amongst election professionals. Very, very interesting. Saying, quote, "I will continue my fight for restoring the confidence of Colorado voters against lies in the politicians or interest groups that seek to weaponize election administration for political advantage." That seems to be a direct shot at President Trump. Then you head over to the Senate nomination, Representative Ron Hanks. Let's read up a little bit about him because he is quite interesting. So let's go ahead and see here. First, he was at the insurrection. He was sworn in to the Colorado House of Representatives following his 2020 election, but he was a part of the insurrection in 2021. In addition to that, he said that Tina Peters has done no wrong, saying she's a Gold Star mom and a public servant. There's no evidence she did anything wrong. He also went to Arizona to observe the Arizona audit, then also went with Mike Lindell to promote false election claims. What he had done overall was really associate himself with the insurrection, associate himself with the big lie, and that is what he ran on for this primary. Now, I would say one thing that alarms me is the fact that he got 46% of the vote in Colorado. The fact that 285,000 Colorado residents felt comfortable voting for someone who attended the insurrection to the United States Senate. Very, very interesting. I think that it's something that, especially looking back at what had happened on January 6th and what had happened as a result of these election lies, is simply wrong. It just should not have happened. Obviously, the insurrection never should have happened. And looking at the fact that a candidate who actively participated in it got 46% of the vote and also continues to push the election rhetoric that Colorado was stolen, a 14-point state, that the Electoral College was stolen, X, Y, and Z, it makes it more alarming, the fact that they got that amount of vote. But at the end of the day, they were rejected on the ballot by Joe O'Dea, who is now in this election and said that President Biden won the 2020 election and also has taken some pretty controversial positions on abortion when it comes down to the Senate election, something that will definitely help O'Dea in the general election. And then in the other race I wanted to talk about was the governorship. So Greg Lopez, a former suburban Denver mayor who was placed on the ballot after promising the state GOP convention that he'd pardon Tina Peters if elected. Pardon the person who helped people undermine the fairness of an election. I mean, that is why we start to see this pushback on candidates like this, because Republicans in some of these states aren't willing to put up with that. And looking at who he lost it to a more traditional Republican. It doesn't say much about Heidi Ganahl's positions on overall the 2020 election or things of that nature, just election integrity and election security. But it seems as if there was a pushback in a very similar voting fashion to candidates that continued to push this election lie across the state of Colorado. And it says here, this contest played at the midpoint of a primary season that has tested the resonance of Trump's election falsehoods. In some states, it has been effective. In other states, it has not. And in the state of Colorado, outside of Lauren Boebert's district, it did not seem to be too effective. And this actually helps the GOP. As much as the Make America Great Again, the Trump-wing Republicans might not necessarily see this as a victory, Republicans in general absolutely should. And I say that because these Republicans are by far more electable for 2022. Yes, some of these Republicans might not be as conservative as the base might want. But clearly, the Republicans in Colorado voted for them for a reason, and I think it was the right decision. For instance, Joe O'Dea, a pro-choice Republican running against Michael Bennet. Michael Bennet won his race back in 2010, slammed his Republican opponent for being pro-choice, and it was effective. Despite 2010 being a red wave year where even the state of Illinois went red, Colorado remained blue. And he did that successfully. Went on to 2016 and also defended his Senate seat successfully. Now going into 2022, there is an expectation that he does hold on to it. But I can't say that Colorado is less competitive now with this GOP nominee. In fact, I would suggest that it is more competitive. The Senate race could be a dark horse scenario, where there is a last-minute surge in GOP support. Nobody was expecting it. Nobody was funneling tens of millions of dollars into the race like they might be in Georgia, Arizona, New Hampshire, Nevada. But Colorado slips under the radar, and the Republicans come out ahead or come out very close to defeating Michael Bennet. A victory is a victory in the U.S. Senate. 6 years is 6 years. Regardless of what you win by, you serve for the entire 6 years. But it is interesting to say and see if this pro-choice Republican, anti-election light Republican, ends up in a position of power across the state of Colorado, especially in a year such as this one. And I think if anyone was to do it, it would be Joe O'Dea. As for the governor election, this one probably is a lot less competitive, but when you have Heidi Ganahl, who isn't Greg Lopez, that helps the Republican Party. I can't say it would be enough to win. Jared Polis is a very popular governor, one of the more popular Democrats across the nation, and he also had a pretty impressive victory back in 2018. His approval rating's high, has a lot of room to fall, also can fall on the Biden victory. I mean, what we have seen thus far is that even if Colorado was to shift in the way that Virginia did in their 2021 governor election, Colorado would still vote blue. So I would say for right now, Democrats shouldn't be super alarmed for the governor election. Not so much for the Senate election, but I could imagine that it got more competitive. As for the state Secretary of State election, I think, as I have said, for the Senate and governor election, Democrats should still rely and expect on a victory within the state. It's not as much of a swing state as it was in the past, but I can't say that the Republicans have the worst candidate either. In fact, I think they have one of the strongest ones that they could have. They have one who has said the election was not rigged, went after those who would call the election rigged. And at the end of the day, has the R by their name, meaning any Republican who voted for Tina Peters or Mike O'Donnell, who did not believe that the election was fair, legitimate, X, Y, and Z, will still vote for the Republican over the Democrat. It isn't a question about enthusiasm, because at the end of the day, they are still going to vote in their House elections, they are still going to vote in their Senate elections, and just because they didn't get the right Senate, governor, or Secretary of State nominee doesn't mean that they aren't going to vote maybe. I could see definitely lack of enthusiasm if the GOP candidates just simply weren't electable or weren't good for whatever reason. But I think they definitely have it here. And I think that there is also some type of shift that we could see walked back against the Democrats in some of these more suburban, some of these more urban areas that might be completely against electing a Make America Great Again Republican that is willing to elect any of the three Republicans that were nominated to Secretary of State, Senate, or Governor. because what they did was defeat the more extreme, more right-wing candidates that voters would have easily rejected. And now, I would say, Republicans at least have somewhat of a fighting chance in the state of Colorado for the 2022 midterm elections. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.